Okay, we'll start. So welcome to our first webinar of the series, where today we're talking about why finance and HR are so intrinsically linked and mission critical to your company's success. My name is Ellie Cooper. I'm founder of Cooper Financials. We do bookkeeping, accounting, and FD services for small businesses. We really try and look at the finances as a holistic view of the company, which is why we have incredible people like Jeff that we work with who are specialists in other areas of business. So Jeff, if you want to give a quick introduction of yourself, and then I'll go into what we're going to speak about today.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Ellie. And it's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much for the invite and for the clever idea to kind of throw this together. I've been wanting to work alongside a financial guru such as yourself and to kind of get the messaging out in terms of how important it is to have this relationship between HR and finance. So my name's Jeff Wellstead, and I'm the founder and CEO of Big Bear Partners. I've been going with that business since 2014, but I basically, as an American, have been over here in the UK for the past 20 years, working primarily with hypergrowth technology and biotech companies, basically helping them at a very early stage, typically, create their entire people strategy, and basically build out all the different component elements that are required for an organization to expand pretty rapidly, usually after they've received a good chunk of funding, and then just make sure that they can kind of keep everything on the rails and kind of thrive in that environment and make good use of that money. And people are a very, very central part to that whole process. So that's very much the work that I do with startup and scale up organizations, and it's great to be working along partners such as Ellie, because that is an area I know very little about, and so it's wonderful to be able to throw those things over the fence to her and say help, and have her manage it for me. So
yeah, of course, nice. All right, so today we're going to go through a couple of things, and the main point we're trying to get across in this webinar and our first webinar is why you need to think of finance and HR at the same time and not just one or the other or in their separate environments. So the first part is looking at why they're mission critical to your company's success. We're also going to go through what strategic values can finance and HR provide for your company, and why these two functions are tied together in the effort to forecasting company achievement. And then finally, looking into how we optimize our organizational structure as a small business to integrate both HR and finance roles.
And the reason why this aspect is so important, I learned this lesson rather very early on, especially in startup and scale up world, is that you have a very, very finite amount of money that has come to you, and you're typically at these early stages not necessarily pulling down much by way of revenue, certainly not enough to become profitable at the moment. And so basically everything you spend money on is in essence burning money. And so that's what I always have to be extraordinarily conscious of. And it's always this weird kind of an understandable dichotomy between the founder / CEO's ambitions to take this money that he or she has rightfully and through the expense of a lot of energy and focus finally won. And now it's a function of how do we go spend it, but spend it carefully, spend it wisely. And look, people are, somewhere between 70 and 80% of the balance sheet. Yet you can't really basically grow your business, especially the types of businesses that I work with, which are typically, technically oriented, knowledge-based businesses where people are everything. And so therefore really critical that we basically try to reduce the risks associated with the people side of the business, which, kind of like brings about the fact that they are central to your success, at the same time, the most unpredictable and potentially the most volatile aspect of your business. And so to create a level of predictability in that space is really essential. So it's important, for instance, you be hyper targeted in terms of the types of individuals you need to hire to do exactly what that will have what impact on the business, and to basically work with finance and to kind of make sure that you're determining that early on. You also have to be like super incredibly thorough with onboarding, which is oftentimes something that we just overlook. But if we're going to make the best use of these precious assets that we fought so long and hard to kind of get on board, we have to make sure that they are totally tuned up and ready for the next 90 days. And that means we have to make sure that that we've been really clear about expectations, that we've plugged them into the tools and the people and the processes that are required to be successful here, and that we really nurture that relationship early on. So that's really critical. And we have to make sure too that we have some kind of a tracking mechanism to kind of measure periodic success or potentially failure, or struggles and issues and concerns, so that we basically can iron out that level of volatility. We have to kind of create a more predictive sense of science. I mean, from an HR perspective, to the extent possible, we need to be kind of tracking either really thorough reporting or minimally, using some kind of analytical capability, oftentimes that come off the back of the human resource software that we have brought on board. And I spend a lot of time in the HR technology space because it's essential that you get that formula right to be able to track that stuff. But look, in startup world and scale up world, it's wonderful to have feelings and sentiments and anecdotes as to why you think a particular individual is behaving or working in a particular way, or why you feel like the workforce is shifting this way or that. Data is a lot more useful, and it's really important also in your conversations with finance to make sure that you're both operating from a point of sort of a data-driven understanding of the business. It's really powerful when you get into the nuts and bolts of human resource management, just how impactful from a finance perspective it can be. And you immediately realize, wow, I need basically a cohort of experts around me to kind of work this way through. We have a finite amount of money. We have a huge hiring plan. We need to kind of think about the phasing of that. We need to think about, the benchmarking of compensation and benefits data to attract the right people. We have to think about the employee value proposition overall that we put together, for attracting these people and, importantly, keeping these people. We have to make sure that our managers and leaders are ready for this journey as well, because people really, really do resonate, obviously with great leadership and management, and equally so, they will exit a company, very quickly off the back of not having great management or leadership. So planning, shaping, forecasting, cash flow management, making decisions about technology, making decisions about people, making sure that our employee value proposition is top notch. All of those decisions, I would make hand in hand with finance, and would never venture out on my own, to kind of make that happen.
It's interesting. I went to the Web Summit recently in Lisbon, and it's lots of big tech companies from around the world who come and speak. And some of them are, one-man bands who have their own software, and others are large multinationals. But the common theme amongst every single presentation was problems, people, opportunities, people. It's really like the core of every business, right? And I think sometimes it can be overlooked or not thought about deeply enough, or like you said, sometimes not looked at from a data side of things, instead more of a intrinsic kind of feeling, which is good, but should be used alongside data as well. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Just to kind of verify that, you know what I mean, that your intuition, if you will, is aligned with what you're seeing from a factual perspective. And if there's those two things are not meshing or aligned, then, examine that too, and try to figure out what's going on. But data at the end of the day, especially if it's well captured and well curated and clean, as data always ever needs to be, it can be an invaluable tool. because it also helps you speak to a degree. It's kind of like the common language denominator between finance and HR. So if I come to you, Ellie, and I say, God, really having some difficulty with attrition, have a lot of people leaving, in the first year of employment. And and I just feel like there's something we're doing wrong. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it could be in the onboarding process. It could be, the quality or lack thereof of our early stage managers or inexperienced managers even. I don't know, but I know, it's not optimal. And in truth, as we'll get into later in the presentation, it's more than not optimal. It can kill a business from a cost perspective. And so that's the kind of stuff that having critical data around will really kind of like raise the bar in terms of the conversation and the effectiveness and impact you can have, with your finance partner. So.
And speaking of data, you put together this super shocking calculation. Do you want to run through that?
We can do, yeah. If you wanted to, just to kind of like chat about this slide real quick, the HR's OKRs and financial impact.
Yes, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I just thought I'd kind of go through this real quick. I borrow a lot of graphics from this group called AIHR, which is a wonderful training group based in the Netherlands. And I've done some work with them in the past, and they just do a wonderful job thinking through the more advanced concepts associated with human resources and the way to kind of think more strategically, if you will, about how to support your business. And so I would definitely encourage people to go over there and to kind of inspect the stuff that they've got going on. But one of the great graphics they sent across was, here are the sort of like kind of key results, thinking about things like objectives and key results, OKRs. Some of the key results that HR and objectives that HR ought to be thinking about. And wow, I went through it and I was like, gosh, like this is a pretty heavy duty list. It's really difficult to read in this presentation, but I'll just give you a couple of tasters. But, this notion of becoming an irresistible employer. This is something that Josh Bersin and the Josh Bersin Academy came up with, which again is another wonderful book. Typically talks about enterprise level organizations, but nonetheless, a lot of the concepts, kind of float seamlessly across any size organization. But this notion of, what makes us special, what makes us interesting, what makes us attractive, and importantly, why would I never want to leave here? There's a lot that goes into that equation. It's your compensation and benefits ratios and relative competitiveness. It is the cool, open-minded, and clever policies that give people a sense that you value them as individuals and you value their private life as much as you value their work. It's your reward and recognition strategy. It's the way you communicate, the way you're organized. It's the way that that managers act as coaches, not just sort of micromanagers. It's the way that leaders inspire and provide direction and vision, for the organization. It's a whole multitude of things. So these are things that are really critical to think about. And again, gosh, almost 90% of these issues, whether it becoming a good, strong, retentive employer, capturing continuous feedback and sentiment, attracting the best possible talent on the market, making your leaders and managers better folks in terms of their function, creating a great place to work. These things sound wonderful when you talk about them. Every one of them has a financial impact, right? Do I have the right software? Did I develop the right policies? And have I priced out the impact of those policies with finance? What about our phased hiring? And if we're going to go after certain specialty hires, how do I make sure that we're not breaking the bank hiring one person when I could have potentially hired 3 people for the same money and had the same impact? How do I work that through with finance and figure out the right phasing of this? Check the benchmarking on this and make sure that also we don't get into trouble down the road where we've got a couple of like mega superstars that are getting paid well over the mark. And then, hey, it starts to get out there that, a couple of people are paid way, way more than other folks are paid. And, things start to break down and get frustrated. So that's all I wanted to say about this slide. Again, this is the kind of stuff that we should all be thinking about, but never in the absence of good financial guidance, for sure. But anyway, sorry. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump into that other slide, Ellie, if that makes sense. What does it cost to lose a good employee? So there are varying different, kind of percentages out there in terms of this calculation. But if you just click to the next slide, if you think about the fact that you're going to lose momentum in terms of the thing you hired that employee to do, that the loss of that momentum is going to cause you a productivity challenge that other people are potentially going to have to step in and hopefully, deliver to, but are likely not able to because they weren't hired to necessarily manage that. So you're going to have that downtime. You're going to have frustration amongst their peers and colleagues, that somebody has left the organization. So that's a morale challenge. You're going to have a training and development challenge, either to get the existing staff to kind of pick up that slack, or when you go out and spend more money recruiting a replacement for this individual, you're going to have to then train them up. And there's going to also be that lag in productivity. And all that adds up to, according to the CIPD, a factor of 1.5%, or 1.5 times, if you will, the salary of the individual who left, right? And so if you just do a quick calculation and you take a look at your attrition, and you say you're a 200-person company, and say that 20%, you figure this is not all attrition, by the way. We're only looking for voluntary attrition where people have raised their hand saying, I no longer want to be here. I got someplace else I want to go. Thanks for looking after me and good luck. So in this particular case, this poor company has a 20% voluntary attrition rate, which is high, okay? And the reason why you know it's high is when you run the calculation based on your average salary. Let's say your average salary is 45,000, right, per year, and you multiply 45,000 times 1.5, that factor that CIPD recommended, you end up with 67,500 pounds as an impact for one individual. Multiply that times 20, and now you're talking 1.35 million. That is sunk cost. It is unrecoverable, and arguably it comes with damage. Okay, so this is something you need to look at as an HR professional, and your finance person can certainly help you with this, to say, we're doing something wrong. How do we know what we're doing is wrong? Where are the issues? How do we address these things systemically and at their core and urgently? Because 1.35 million is a big fat chunk of investment money that you're never going to get back, number one. Number two is gone forever, to the extent that that's now burned, and you could have been spending that money on all sorts of great initiatives. But this is a very, very clear use case that says, if I had always ever been working alongside my finance person, and I had this as a business rationale, for instance, to bring in, a couple of clever new policies, to train up my management and leadership staff, to kind of create a wellness program because we're in a high stress market or environment, or whatever the case, whatever it is I needed to solve for. Ellie, in this particular case, would have wanted to know that it otherwise would have cost her 1.35 million, and to kind of have that forward vision to say, let's avoid this as a problem instead of basically trying to soak it up and then kind of react to it in the aftermath. That just doesn't make any sense. So this is another great interface, between HR and finance.
Yeah, I was looking at those numbers like, wow.
Yeah.
And I think this is especially important for startups. One, because any money lost as a startup is really detrimental. But two, because I think often startups have higher attrition rates to begin with because everything is new and you're figuring things out. So really understanding first what is your attrition rate, and then doing this calculation so you can make those adjustments as needed. Like, yeah, it's game changer, really.
It really is. It really is. So yeah, this was another interesting one as well. And actually, the background on this one, this slide also stolen unabashedly from my friends over at the AIHR, is actually a model that talks about the reasons why people leave on a percentage basis. And you can see from this graphic, there are quite a few reasons up there, right? I mean, what are we talking? Almost it's like five, yeah, like 10 different areas, basically that people have listed typically across multiple different industry sectors as to what the reasons were for leaving. And weirdly, compensation tends to be the least used reason, for leaving. Albeit lately, kind of post-pandemic, it's been sort of a wild ride with salaries, and not to mention sort of the advent of new technologies that are popping up left, right, and center. We are creating yet some other, extremely hot markets in especially software and technology, especially in the AI space. So there will be some compensation concerns in that space. But look, a lot of people leave because, things are too stressful. Possibly it's a demographic issue, getting married, moving, having children, can't manage this. It could be an age issue, could be a tenure issue, who knows? Um, could be leadership and management. These are folks just not looking after me, and it's really problematic. So these are all critical areas, for HR to be taking a look at, but importantly, being able to convert into some level of understanding, into a data format. So what tools are you using in terms of employee listening, for instance? And again, working with a tool as an example, pull one out of the air, like Culture Amp as an example, whereby it has a really powerful employee listening capability, but much more so, it has a really cool analytics capability off the back of the responses that you get, for answering these questions across your company. It's the kind of data that you can absolutely then sit down with finance and then go to the board to say, look, this is what we're seeing in the organization. There are Culture Amp has this all mapped out, but there's something like 19 different factors that their questions are targeted to in a scientific and statistically significant manner. And so that stuff is pretty ironclad in terms of the results you get, and potentially then the anticipated impacts that they will have. That's a place for HR to kind of like really partner very closely with finance to say, wow, we've got a problem, with coworkers. We have a problem, with overall work satisfaction in these particular areas. And then to kind of like brainstorm, with your finance guru and say, what ways can we, without breaking the bank and without burning too much of our precious cash, what can we start to think about that's going to have an impact on these factors? And tools like Culture Amp actually have, kind of great programs, remedial programs that they have seen work amongst their customers, and they share those back in their applications. But that's the kind of thing, that suddenly makes an application cost of, say, 8,000 a year, for a company of 200 people, suddenly seem like peanuts compared to an attrition, kind of impact of negative 1.35 million. And so this is the kind of stuff that we want to be always looking at, and frankly, that finance obviously would be keen to kind of know about as well. They're not just about the numbers, but they sure as heck can help us think in a more critical fashion, in a more logical fashion, and certainly, much more importantly, in a much more commercial fashion, which I find really useful.
Yeah, I think it's quite empowering actually to know that compensation is relatively low on the list of why people leave. As startups, we don't have lots of cash to be the top employer in terms of compensation. And probably when you speak to your finance team, they're not gonna give the budget for the top compensation, but you can look at all these other areas. How can we make our employees' life better? And make them want to stay in the company, and still give a fair compensation, obviously, but it doesn't mean it has to be, top of the market rate.
Yeah,
So
and you can get very creative, with ways to attract people from a compensation perspective and make it, a total compensation calculation. I mean, there's base salary, of course, has to be livable. because you don't want people worried about it every day going to work. Can I afford my commute? That's not clever. But think about reward schedules. Think about, employee stock option, ideas. Think about spot rewards. Think about time off. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to compensate people, to kind of be clever. You don't have to break the bank and always ever pay north of the 75th percentile, in every case. But yeah, it's a good point, Ellie.
Yeah, just a question to put you on the spot a little bit,
Yeah.
but how do you think these kind of factors have changed now that we've gone through the period of COVID and a lot of remote working? And do you think people still want the same things, or do you think the expectations have changed a bit?
It's an excellent question. I mean, look, I read all the literature that kind of comes across my computer, my phone, and everything else on a regular basis, and try to keep my finger on the pulse with other HR leaders as to what trends and so forth they're seeing. Look, I mean, a big chunk of this is this return to work, return to the office, kind of challenge for folks. I think a lot of people really quite enjoyed not having to commute, albeit, of course, tooling and connections and things of that nature sometimes were challenging. And they're realizing, there's this weird balance to kind of be had in terms of my time. I've been given back almost 2-3 hours worth of time every day that I'm not needlessly uh, and frustratingly kind of like having to run between train stations and jump on, trains full of other coughing people and all sorts of things. So that this notion of creating a hybrid workspace is a really big challenge. And I think that has affected a lot of people too. They've become used to kind of having a lot more free time, kind of working from home and kind of mixing and matching, workload and work issues with private, challenges, running errands, getting the kids to and from school, and just, sometimes just taking time out in your own space, with the fact that and managers also recognize, the power of collaboration, and spontaneous connection, with people while they're in the office. The way that problems can get solved in an instant, just by rolling your chair, 2 desks down and having a quick chat with somebody. Um, that's really kind of another component too. And it's the way we communicate. That's another thing that continues to come up: communication and collaboration in a remote first or hybrid work environment can be challenging, right? It takes an extra effort to kind of stop, plan, figure out, coordinate, logistics in terms of who's going to be on what call when, and that could be challenging and can kind of take companies back a few steps in terms of that. And when you don't see people's expressions and you don't get a visceral sense of their nonverbal behaviors and their postures and their focus, it can be harder to connect with folks. So I think, that's a very interesting, kind of point you bring up, Ellie. There are lingering hangover effects of this that are not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, interesting. It's almost like a new skill set of how do we communicate remotely, how do we manage remotely, how do we lead remotely.
Yep,
Yeah,
very true.
it'll be interesting to see how it is in the future.
Indeed.
Is there anything else you want to say on this before we move on to the next slide?
No, I'm good.
All right. So what I wanted to speak on the back of everything that Jeff has just spoken about is how do we implement these synergies between your HR and finance department. And for some of you listening, you might be the HR and finance department. And so this is more of a mindset exercise of how do I look at both of these areas together when I'm making decisions for my company. And for others of you, this will be, you'll have your HR lead and your finance team that you can put in meetings together to work through some of these things. But one of the first ways to really make sure there's a big collaboration between the two teams is inputting your HR metrics and OKRs into your management accounts. Investors will love to see these kind of things, but it also makes sure that your finance team and HR team are talking every single month and looking at these pieces of data together. there's also, sorry, also looking at your employee life cycle and looking at your attrition rate, as we spoke about, and understanding all the different areas, looking at the data, basically understanding all the different areas of where your finance or your cash reaches each employee. So right from the recruitment up to onboarding, up to when they're a profitable staff member, and then even when they decide to leave or decide to move internally, what that looks like, and have meetings about that between both your HR lead and your finance lead. Once you understand this data in your own company, because for each company it's going to look a bit different, you can start to work together to manage this from an operational standpoint. Like, when do we need to hire new people and how much can we pay them?
And that's like such a big thing, Ellie, isn't it? I mean, when you think about like the challenges, yeah, I come from the US, right? Where basically your notice period was like 2 weeks. So literally
Yeah.
you would quit on a Friday and they might ask you to stick around for a couple more weeks just to do a handover. Seldom does that ever happen. It's usually, right, that's my last day, and then I'm on to the next. And though, so from a speed of turning a candidate into a new hire, it's not nearly as much of an issue as it is over here in Europe, where potentially you could have a notice period of up to 6 months, for some hires. Oftentimes it's 2 months, 3 months, but still that's a huge chunk of time to kind of figure out how to manage. And it gets tricky, I found anyway, from a phasing perspective, when you start to think, okay, we've just gotten our big chunk of investment. Now, what we really want to focus on is taking our product to market, and we want to kind of open up 9 new markets, say across Europe. So we need to hire salespeople, and we need marketing people, and we need account management people, and we need, support mechanisms and things of that nature. HR, go do that stuff. And it's like, okay, can we just be a little bit careful? And then you go and talk to finance about it and say, well, this is what the boss, the founder of the company just told me to go do. And you basically look at that and be like, okay, let's be clear about something. The investment money we get is not one lump sum that ends up in the bank at the end of the month. It's going to be phased, right? And so we're only going to have so much breathing room, and I've got other things to spend this money on.
Yeah.
Like, like office expenses, like utilities, like all sorts of leasing arrangements and everything else. And that's when you start getting into the reality of like, okay, so we need to be really careful, very planful, in our thinking here. And that's why it's mission critical that finance and HR are just tied to the hip on that stuff.
Yeah, and I think learning each other's languages as well, like how you presented that calculation of the 1.35 million, to me,
Right.
like that really resonates, because that's a number and this is how I work, right? But then equally from a finance perspective, looking at HR, understanding what kind of aspects are they looking at and what's important to them, and really trying to find a common ground so you can make productive decisions for the business.
And that you're solving business problems all day long, right? So a lot of those things I read back in one of the earlier slides, they sounded like a lot of feel-good programs. Wouldn't this be wonderful if, kind of thing. And yeah, to a degree, they are, but every one of those has an underpinning associated with a productivity factor, with a retention factor, with a motivational factor, a collaboration and communication factor. So if I'm not, as an HR person, solving for optimizing the business and the people within it and creating the right, kind of structures and environments and things of that nature, and providing the right tools and the right guidance for folks to have an optimized experience at work, I'm not really serving the business, the very business that's paying me, you're right, to kind of serve it. And I'm not going to know those things. I'm not going to be able to validate those things unless I speak with you, Ellie, and say, here's what I think, or what the data is telling us is problematic, for instance, off the back of a massive employee survey. Say there are analytics that come back, for instance, about the fact that the quality of our management teams, for no fault of their own, not because it's malicious, they've just never been trained, right? They've just been thrown into this position, as so often happens in early stage companies, and they're not doing a great job of it. and they're really frustrating employees, and employees are labeling that over and over and over again as one of the top reasons why they chose to leave. So, getting together with Ellie would have been my first port of call to say, I got a problem here. You remember those attrition figures we went through, and basically that kind of blew our minds. I think I might have, found one of the core issues. But what are we going to do about this, right? And how quickly can we have an impact to stop the stem of this attrition, or stem the flow of this attrition, is what I'm trying to say. And to kind of work with you, Ellie, to say, here are, for instance, some really cool and very highly impactful, intense management training courses. But there's also a question as to, we promoted these poor people into these positions. They might not want to be managers. So what are we going to do about internal mobility? What if we have to make decisions about 50% of our management core and say, they've already raised their hand. They've told us over and over again, I don't want to manage anybody. I just want to be a strong individual contributor. Well, that's an organizational design issue. That's potentially a compensation issue. It's also a sort of internal mobility issue. Like, what are we going to do basically to backfill those? We're not going to go out and hire a bunch more managers when now we suddenly have this kind of overage of individual contributors. Ellie and I have to work that out, right? We have to kind of like plan that through, then go with a list of potential recommendations to the board, and the founder and so forth, and say, here's our conundrum. Here's our problem. Here's what we think the core issues are associated with that. And here's what we think are possible solutions for that. And this will all get fixed if you guys accept these recommendations in the space of, I don't know, 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, whatever it is. But that's a very classic kind of collaboration that I've come to enjoy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the management. I was reading an article about that recently, how a lot of people, the natural progression of a career is to move up the ranks and become a manager. And actually, a large majority of people are not interested in that side of business and instead want to be an individual contributor, whatever that looks like in their industry. And so, yeah, kind of rethinking the whole structure of a business to serve that and make sure you're not paying these people to be managers when they're not, and instead, compensating them for the area of business that they enjoy doing and what they want to be doing.
Exactly.
And ultimately, a happy workforce will come to work, they'll be productive, and they'll stay, and they'll enjoy themselves, and it's a better working environment for everyone, I think.
Spot on. Yeah, very good. Very, very good point. Very good point.
So a couple of specific ways that you can collaborate between the HR and finance department. So one of the big ones which we've been talking about already is this idea of strategic workforce planning. It's something we do actually at Cooper Financials as well, looking at how many clients can each specialist serve. What does that look like in terms of revenue? What does that look like in terms of compensation for that specific employee? And also, what does that look like in terms of when we have to start hiring for the next payroll specialist, let's say, to make sure there's enough overlap so that individual employee doesn't get super overwhelmed with their work. There's enough time for training. Clients are getting the best possible service. And this is something that you need to work together on. HR people obviously know the job description, what type of people we're looking for, what those specific people are interested in terms of compensation and other areas of perks or benefits of the role. And then the finance team understand what does that look like in terms of revenue and cost. So it helps us basically efficiently allocate the resources that the company has, whilst still making sure we're getting the best possible employee for that specific job. And just in line with that is also compensation planning. So again, looking at what's our budget, what have we spoken with the investors about in terms of our people budget, and how can we maximize that to make sure we have the right number of people with the right skill set who are going to stay on, and we're still going to meet our budget.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, it's so critical too, to kind of, especially when you're a young company, to have a sense of what the market is paying folks, in your particular industry sector, importantly also in the particular geography that you're looking at. because it does get that specific. But yeah, kind of working with tools. I've used a couple in the past, like Figures. There's another company that's relatively new called Pave, P-A-V-E, PayScale, and there's another one called ChartHop, which is also quite useful in terms of that offer kind of, you know what I mean, like really, really powerful insights and data visualizations around you know who's paying what in your particular sector, and then importantly, they have scenario planning sheets which you and your finance person could spend, I mean, just oodles of time playing around with, where you basically start to mess around and play with, well, what if we hired this group of people first and then that group of people, or what if we hired this C-level person and then we basically then delayed the hiring of these 3 software people. And the scenario planning, you know, can kind of help you think through what the financial impacts of those things are going to be, whilst you're also thinking about the productivity impacts of the organization, you know, on the organization. So anyway, sorry.
No, that's a good point. And we partner with a company called Deal as well for
Deal's
global
great.
payroll. And they also have a similar simplified calculator just to see, okay, if I hire someone in Germany versus France, what's the difference in cost? And it's good, like, again, reiterating the point that data helps make these decisions, and the more data you can get, the more accurate data you can get, the better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And working alongside professionals like that who spend all that time, effort, and money doing the surveys, and they get real-time data from real companies. That's very much where you want to be. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. So another way that you can collaborate HR and finance is with talent acquisition and retention. So again, like we've spoken about, how do we attract the right talent? Is that a specific compensation package, bonus package, employee benefits package? And then once they're here, how do we make sure they stay here? And working together to look at realistically, what does that look like department to department? And making sure you're both aligned on the strategy to make sure you're getting to the ultimate business goal of keeping the business going and scaling as quickly as possible.
Indeed.
And on the back of that, there's training and development costs as well. So again, like Jeff was speaking about, sometimes you can bring up a training and development course and it can feel super expensive, and you might be intimidated by that. And immediately from a financial perspective, you say, no, we can't do that. But if you look at the cost that comes from not going on that training and development program, that's when you can really weigh it up and say, okay, this is actually worth the short-term cash constraint to have this long-term gain of highly skilled employees who are happy to come to work.
You know, if I could just dive in there too, it's really tricky, right? Because HR oftentimes struggles to rationalize, you know, the implementation of learning and development initiatives. Primarily because I think people have been burned in the past, understandably. Classroom training, for instance, with, you know, a very few companies back in the day before this onslaught of online education everywhere. It was horribly expensive. It was $1,200 to $1,800, you know, for 2 or 3 days worth of training and development. And what did you get from it? You know, it was difficult to measure. Nowadays, you know, with the advent of, I guess, what they're calling MOOCs, you know, this notion of these online learning management systems, and now these learning experience platforms really hitting the marketplace, you get so much more value for money. In terms of this, companies like edX and Degreed and Udemy for business and Coursera basically are now kind of covering off the entire depth and breadth of you know, employee training requirements, from, you know, heavily technical software based you know, kind of programming skills, all the way through to, you know, the softest of skills in terms of emotional intelligence and leadership and things of that nature. Not all of these things and requirements are necessarily solved by online training, but at least you can really kind of bring down the cost of, say, face-to-face interventions. Say if you're going to do like an intensive leadership development, you know, kind of course, and you needed to send, you know, 12 of your leaders on this, and it is a face-to-face thing and so forth. But then again, you can assess between you and your finance, you know, guru, what the relative impact is that's going to have. And hopefully it's going to be a very powerful impact and a measurable impact, importantly. So you can kind of take an ROI kind of an approach to that sort of thing. But at least importantly, you're covering off the broad depth and breadth of learning and development for the rest of the company. And it's important because knowledge-based companies, that's arguably one of the reasons why people, A, join in the first instance, B, stick around, because they know they're always ever going to be developed and they'll always ever have those opportunities. So it's a super important component.
Yeah, and I think it also calls to getting a super rock star HR person involved, because they know which ROI, which training and development course is going to give you the biggest ROI, because there are so many opportunities for small businesses to learn online, and sometimes they're great and sometimes they're not, and a good HR person will know which one's which and be able to point you in the right direction for your team. Yeah, so another area is about performance management, and I think this one is quite interesting because usually we look at it in terms of, a salesperson and they get sales commission and it's super simple. But I think there are other areas that you can provide performance-based management bonuses or different types of benefits to employees. One of the things we do is after a client has been with us for a year, we give a proportion of that revenue to all of our staff, and it's a client retention bonus, basically. And it keeps us all aligned. And so when you're looking from an HR perspective and a financial perspective, you have the same goal. And then you can put different things in place to make sure everyone's looking in the same direction and moving towards the ultimate target, whatever that is for your business. And as well, employee benefit management. So again, coming back to the data, making sure you're looking at what benefits do you have in place, what benefits could you put in place, what's their potential ROI across the company, and then also how much money do you have to work with this. And I would say sometimes from an HR perspective, maybe you're looking to the finance person and saying, what's the budget? When actually the conversation should be, what should the budget be based off of all these factors? And oftentimes, even with investors, there is wiggle room if you have the right rationale behind why you're increasing the budget in certain areas. And so then you can come to an agreement, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the first answer that finance person gives you. Another area is cost control and reduction. So identifying all the different areas of cost that surround people. And I think a lot of times it's easy to forget the kind of hidden costs, like this employee needs a laptop, or they have health insurance, or different areas of benefits that you're not necessarily thinking about when you look at what's their annual salary going to be. So making sure that you have that, you understand that, and you're both on the same page with what's realistically can be provided by the company at that given time. And then finally, talking about succession planning together with your finance and HR team. So looking into the future of the business and how people are going to grow. And I think it is one of like a super important aspect of why people stay in certain jobs, is because they can see a future there and they can see potential promotions or knowledge gains or whatever it may be. And so looking at that, firstly, does that mean you go down the management route? Maybe not. But also, what would that look like in terms of cost and in terms of timeline, so you can make sure you have the cash to actually make those things happen and not give empty promises to your employees.
Yeah, I mean, that whole scenario planning thing, Ellie, is so critical, isn't it? I mean, to kind of almost like taking, a timeout in the year to kind of go through this, typically in Q4 of any given year, and to kind of say, well, where do we think the moves are going to take place next year? Who do we think might get promoted up to sort of a senior level role, and therefore kind of predicate some level of a bump in compensation and or kind of employee share allocation or something. And where potentially might we have fallout? Where are we potentially anticipating attrition in certain areas, which happens, a fair amount, unfortunately, in startup scale up world. There's, different different horses, different courses, different challenges, different contexts, different switches in the market, and all sorts of issues will occur. But the more you can kind of plan for, a move in this direction versus that direction, or a shift, or a reduction, or whatever it is, the more you can have intelligent conversations, as Ellie said, with your investors, and with the people who are going to be impacted, kind of directly with this. So that's it's really important, again, that HR and finance collaborate on that too.
Yeah, and we've given you a lot of examples of how they can interact, but of course there are even more. And one of the things you'll also have received along with this webinar is a checklist, and in there's some other areas where you and your HR team and your finance team can sit in a meeting and speak about different areas, and also encourage it not to be, a one-time meeting where you have a chat and tick that box, but more a regular collaboration over time as your business is growing, and it will look different as you raise different money, different series, or yeah, your business model changes. So just finally, Jeff, if you want to speak about the organizational structure.
Yeah, yeah, appreciate. There's a lot to talk about. So I think what I might do is just provide sort of a consolidated view of this whole thing. But look, I mean, one of the things that HR is typically tasked with is sort of the thinking about the structure of the organization in terms of how does decision-making flow? How does communication flow? Who is going to be accountable and responsible for what? Who's going to oversee and support and guide and provide direction for what? And so it's really critical that we think about these things not in isolation of the HR department by any stretch, but we actually collaborate in sort of a cross-collaborative fashion, in a cross-functional fashion, I should say. And finance always ever needs to be, kind of front and center, to that particular challenge, because they will have a very interesting perspective, and possibly a very different perspective than perhaps HR would. I just mentioned a whole bunch of things that are kind of human behaviors associated with how it is organizations are kind of structured. They have a very different view, which is it structured optimally, right? I mean, are we basically kind of optimizing our spend? Are we putting people in the right spots who are going to have the right level of impact, or the most optimized level of impact across different people? So that's basically what kind of work needs to be done in that regard. Open door policy, critical. I just read this amazing book called The Geek Way by Andrew McAfee. I would definitely suggest and strongly recommend it, because it really kind of talks about sort of the most amazing companies, especially in the tech space, and how they basically adopted all these kind of principles around, kind of accepting, well, creating a safe psychological environment, and creating, kind of boundaries around, it's okay to fail, but it's more critical to learn from that failure. How is it we can create flat structures where basically we can empower people to look after themselves, but importantly, look after the teams around them, and that everybody has that level of responsibility of looking after each other, of getting the right information, of communicating the right information. And we're no longer just focused on legacy hierarchical structures. What kind of collaborative tools are we using? Is it Teams, which can be big, expensive, and clunky sometimes, but oftentimes, very reliable and connected to a lot of the other office tools that we use. So that's super convenient. But what about Slack? What about, kind of project management, boards like Asana or Trello or Miro, or Jira for that matter? Those are other tools that we can use to cross collaborate, where everybody can have the view as to how it is we're proceeding on a particular project or a particular program. And that's super, super important. Training people to be super clear and concise with their communication is essential, and kind of creating some cultural norms around that. Be short, sharp, precise, but also empathic. in the way we talk to each other. Really critical. Feedback loops essential, right? I mean, kind of adopting the agile way of working, even loosely, is great. Morning stand-ups, weekly, kind of reviews, working in a sprint fashion, setting sort of 2 weeks aside to really go get some critical stuff done, and then having a retrospective view and discussion with the team afterwards. What should we keep doing? What should we never do again? Excuse me. What lessons have we learned from this? That kind of work is critical. Having regular kind of like company-wide communications and maybe some events too to kind of bring people together, like town hall meetings, or quarterly performance reviews, super important. Always ever kind of allowing people to share their thoughts, their ideas, their minds, with regard to employee forums, for instance, on the internet. Don't be afraid of those things. It's important that people are able to air stuff out, and it's important that HR and leadership monitor that stuff so that they're on top of that as it's flowing. And then sort of, the last one I would kind of like just emphasize is don't forget to celebrate the wins and the things that you got done together. That's super important. Creates such a high level of cohesion, and team togetherness, and sort of tribal. It becomes like a tribal ritual. Definitely celebrate, those kinds of critical wins, because it basically says to people, look, that's the stuff that matters. There's always going to be stuff that we fail doing, or failed to do. There's always going to be stuff that we could have won, but we didn't win. But man, when we do win it and when we don't fail and we really crush it, we want to make sure that we make a lot of noise about it. But those would be the things, Ellie, that I would suggest.
Yeah, I like the approach as well of not just saying how do we do this best, but how do we do this at all, and rethinking, okay, just because this is how it's been done traditionally in corporations for the past X many years, it doesn't mean that we have to follow this same structure, and we can look at becoming a bit more modern and suit it to our company culture and how we want our employees to enjoy the work that they're doing.
Such a good point. Yeah, it's like Elon Musk brought that up like as a big deal, right? This notion of first principles thinking. Knowing what we know now, how would we potentially reinvent it from scratch, right? And make it that much better. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. So that was the end of webinar 1. We have a lot more to discuss in our other webinars. The next one, we're going to be talking about how to know when to hire, whom to hire, and how much to pay them, and also understanding how much will they perform. So essentially navigating human capital challenges in your startup. There's the checklist that we've also sent you via email, so feel free to use that to implement everything we've just been speaking about. And I think the main thing to just get started is put a weekly or monthly meeting in the diary between your HR and finance team and start filling that with action points, and places that you can work on together. But yeah, it's been a pleasure, Jeff. Thanks very much for all of your insights.
No, it's back at you, and I really appreciate you putting this together. This is a brilliant idea.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you.